The Blackwood Forest lived up to its name, especially in late autumn. The ancient pines, thick with shadow even at midday, pressed close to the small, weathered cabin where Elias lived. At 10 years old, Elias moved through the world in a perpetual quiet, a silence born not of choice, but of a fever that had stolen his voice when he was 5. Words, for Elias, were a jumble of sounds he could hear but not produce, a frustration that had long since settled into a quiet resignation. His parents, worn by worry and the hardscrabble life of a mountain farmer, loved him fiercely but often seemed to look through him, as if his silence made him invisible. His only true companionship was the forest itself, a sprawling, echoing world where his quiet presence felt less like a flaw and more like a natural fit. He spent countless hours wandering its familiar paths, his senses sharpened by the absence of sound, noticing the minute rustle of leaves that signaled a deer, the distinct scent of damp earth after a rain, or the subtle shift in wind that portended a change in weather. The forest was his sanctuary, his confidant, a place where he was truly, completely himself. He knew every babbling brook, every moss-covered boulder, every hidden sun-dappled clearing. The rustle of dry leaves underfoot, the distant cry of a hawk, the murmur of the wind through the tall pines. These were the symphonies of his world, a world where his lack of a voice mattered not at all. It was on one such solitary ramble, tracing the familiar deer trails near the forgotten northern ridge, that Elias found her. The scent hit him first, a sharp, metallic tang mixed with the earthy smell of pine and fear, a primal alarm that prickled his skin. He followed it, his heart thudding a nervous rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of cautious curiosity, until he pushed through a curtain of low-hanging fir branches and saw her. A massive black bear, caught in a crude, rusty snare. The steel jaws had clamped around her hind leg, biting deep into flesh, tearing muscle and fur. Her powerful body trembled with exhaustion and pain, but her eyes, wide and wild with a desperate, untamed fury, were fixed on something beneath a gnarled root system nearby. Then he saw them, 3 tiny cubs, no bigger than house cats, huddled together, whimpering softly, their small cries barely audible. Their mother, despite her agony, was positioned to shield them, a living barricade of fur and fierce, primal love, her very life force dedicated to their protection. Elias froze, his breath catching in his throat, a cold knot forming in his stomach. Every tale from the village elders, every whispered warning about the dangers of the Blackwood, screamed at him to run. Bears were wild, untamable, dangerous. They were forces of nature, to be respected from afar, never approached, never interfered with. But looking at the mother's desperate eyes, at the vulnerable pile of fur that were her babies, Elias felt a different kind of pull, a quiet, insistent ache in his chest that overshadowed his fear. He saw in her gaze a mirror of his own voiceless helplessness, a silent plea he instinctively understood. It was a recognition of shared vulnerability, a bond forged in the crucible of fear and abandonment, a sudden, powerful empathy that transcended all boundaries of species. He didn't run. Instead, slowly, deliberately, Elias lowered himself to the damp forest floor. He avoided direct eye contact, a trick he'd learned from observing deer, and focused on the cubs, on their innocent, bewildered faces. He pulled a small, dried apple from his pocket, a treat he'd saved for himself, and gently tossed it a few feet from the bear. The mother's growl was low, a rumbling warning, a deep vibration that Elias felt more than heard, a tremor that spoke of immense power barely contained, but her eyes flickered to the fruit. Elias sat still, unmoving, his patience an unshakable force, until after what felt like an eternity, her great head dipped, and she nudged the apple towards her cubs with her snout. It was a tiny gesture, but to Elias, it was a profound acknowledgement, a silent bridge across the vast chasm between human and wild. He named her and her cubs in his head, bestowing upon them identities that only he would know. She was Shadow, for her dark fur and elusive nature, the largest cub, a brave little male who would occasionally venture a few steps from his mother. Was Rumble, his small growls vibrating through the forest floor like miniature thunder. The smaller, perpetually curious female was Whisper, moving with a delicate grace and soft sighs, and the tiniest, often snuggled deepest into Shadow's fur, was Pebble, a round, innocent ball of fluff that seemed as small and precious as a smooth river stone. For the next 2 days, Elias returned to the snare site, always alone, always careful, moving like a phantom through the trees. He brought fresh berries from the south slope, meticulously gathered, and strips of dried venison he'd expertly and secretly cut from his father's shed, leaving them just within the mother bear's reach. She watched him, wary but no longer hostile, her ears occasionally twitching at the sound of his quiet approach, her large nose testing the air for his scent. He spoke to her in soft, murmuring sounds, not words, but a language of empathy and reassurance, a gentle stream of wordless comfort that seemed to soothe her agitation. He told her stories in his mind, envisioning her understanding, sharing the weight of her suffering without the need for spoken language, a silent monologue of unwavering care and desperate hope. The snare, however, remained. It was too robust for Elias to tackle alone, a cruel contraption of steel and wood, clearly designed by experienced, merciless hands, meant to hold a beast of immense power. And his parents would never understand. They saw the forest as a provider, but also as a relentless, unforgiving threat, a place where wildness reigned supreme and dangerous animals roamed. Wild animals in distress, in their view, were best left to nature's harsh, indifferent course, a brutal but necessary part of the cycle. To interfere, in their eyes, was to invite danger and folly, to disrupt the natural order. That night, sleep evaded Elias. He saw Shadow's pained eyes, the trembling of her great paw, the helplessness of her cubs, their small bodies shivering in the cold. He knew what he had to do, even if it meant risking everything, his safety, his parents' anger, and the fragile peace he had found in his silent world. The thought of leaving them to suffer, to slowly succumb to their injuries and the encroaching winter, was unbearable, a weight heavier than any fear he had ever known. The next morning, armed with a small, rusty saw from his father's toolshed, a tool he'd never dared to touch before, and a coil of worn rope he'd found tucked away in the barn, Elias returned to Shadow. Her condition had worsened significantly. She was weaker, her breathing shallow and ragged, each exhale a visible effort. The wound on her leg, though not visibly infected, looked raw and agonizing, a gaping maw of torn flesh. The cubs whimpered, nudging her, confused by her stillness and silence, their tiny noses pressing into her unresponsive fur. Elias knew he had to act quickly, time was running out. He knelt beside the snare, his small muscles straining, his jaw clenched with determination. The rasping sound of the saw against the thick wooden stake unnervingly loud in the quiet woods, each stroke a battle. He worked with a desperate, singular focus, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill in the air. Shadow watched him, her eyes fixed on his hands, a low, continuous rumble in her chest. It wasn't a growl now, but something akin to a vibration of deep anxiety. A maternal tremor that spoke of her overwhelming fear for her young. When the stake finally gave way with a crack, releasing the tension on the snare, Elias quickly fashioned a makeshift splint for her injured leg from sturdy, pliable branches he'd snapped off a nearby fir, and tied it loosely but securely with strips of cloth he'd torn from his shirt. He knew it wasn't perfect, a clumsy human attempt to mend a wild creature, but it was better than nothing, a small act of defiance against her suffering, a desperate hope. He covered her with a thick, wool blanket he'd snuck from his bed, hoping the warmth would help ward off the chill that was surely exacerbating her shock and preventing healing. Over the next few weeks, Elias became a silent shadow in the Blackwood, a secret guardian. Every day after his chores, when his parents were busy with the farm, Elias would slip away, his heart thrumming with purpose, to Shadow's hidden den. He brought her more nourishing food, including fresh fish he painstakingly caught from the river with a makeshift spear, spending hours by the icy water, and a concoction of wild herbs he'd meticulously crushed, hoping they had healing properties. He changed her rudimentary bandage, gently cleaning the wound, flinching at her soft whimpers of pain, but never stopping, never giving up. His small hands worked with a tenderness that defied his age, a natural-born healer's touch. He spoke to her in hushed tones, words only he understood, telling her stories of the village, of the sun on the mountain peaks, of the quiet hopes he held in his heart, a solitary monologue of unwavering care and desperate hope, a silent plea for her recovery. Shadow, in turn, began to trust him implicitly, her initial wariness melting away into a profound acceptance. She would allow him to sit close, her large head resting near him as her cubs tumbled and played around his feet, their small bodies a whirlwind of fur and energy. Rumble, fearless and boisterous, would paw at his trousers, initiating games of chase through the underbrush. Whisper, always gentle, would nuzzle his hand, seeking comfort and offering soft licks. And tiny Pebble would often curl up in his lap, a warm, purring ball of fur, her innocent trust a balm to his lonely soul. Elias felt a profound connection, a silent conversation passing between them, a shared understanding that transcended words, a bond built on trust and mutual need. He witnessed Shadow's fierce devotion to her cubs firsthand, the way she groomed them with tender meticulousness, guided them through the underbrush with careful nudges, and corrected their playful nips with a gentle but firm paw. He saw the pure, unfiltered love of a mother, and it slowly began to thaw the frozen grief and isolation in his own heart, melting away the years of silent pain. He learned patience, resilience, and the quiet joy of unconditional connection, lessons no human could have taught him. One evening, as the first sparse snowflakes of winter began to fall, painting the forest in a stark, hushed white, Elias was startled by the approach of his father. Elias, his father's voice boomed, sharp with worry and growing anger, cutting through the quiet like a knife. "Where have you been? I thought you were lost. We've been looking for you for hours. Your mother is beside herself." Elias, caught off guard, stumbled, and from his pocket, a small, dried fish, meant for Shadow, fell out onto the snowy ground. His father's eyes narrowed, instantly recognizing the strange item. "Fish? Elias, where did you get this? It's not from our traps. And you know how dangerous it is to be out here alone at dusk. What have you been doing?" Elias tried to explain, tried to gesture towards the north ridge, towards Shadow's hidden den, his hands flailing silently, but no sounds came, only frustrated gasps. His father's frustration grew, fueled by fear for his silent son, by the unknown and the wildness of the forest. "Elias, you know we don't wander off alone, especially with winter coming. And where did you get that blanket? You snuck out with one of your mother's best blankets." As his father's voice rose, sharp with accusation and concern, a low, guttural growl echoed from the shadows beyond the trees. "Shadow! She had followed Elias, sensing his distress, her powerful body moving with a surprising stealth, appearing like a phantom from the deepening twilight, a formidable presence. The cubs, seeing their mother, immediately scampered to her side, pressing into her fur, their small eyes curious and unafraid of Elias's father, their human. Shadow let out another, deeper growl, a clear, resonating warning that vibrated through the cold air, a sound of immense power and protectiveness. Elias's father instinctively reached for the axe strapped to his belt, his hand gripping the worn handle, his body tensing for a fight. But Elias acted without thinking, a surge of protective instinct overriding his fear, a fierce determination blazing in his eyes. He stepped between his father and Shadow, his small body a fragile shield, his determination burning brighter than any spoken word. He looked at his father, his eyes pleading, brimming with an urgency that transcended language, a silent cry for understanding. Then he turned to Shadow and slowly, deliberately, extended an open palm towards her, a gesture of peace and trust. No, he tried to say, the word a strangled, soundless rasp in his throat, a raw gasp that was more air than sound, but filled with immense meaning. No, father. She's family. Shadow, surprisingly, lowered her head, nudging Elias's hand with her snout, a gesture of profound trust and affection. She looked at his father, then back at Elias, a complex understanding in her dark eyes, a silent communication that spoke volumes, confirming the boy's unspoken words. His father, bewildered by the impossible scene before him, a wild bear, known for its ferocity, showing tenderness to his silent son, slowly lowered his axe, his hand loosening its grip. He saw the rudimentary splint on the bear's leg, the faded blanket draped over her back, and the trusting way the cubs looked at Elias, completely unconcerned by his own formidable presence. The sheer, impossible reality of what he was witnessing began to dawn on him, a revelation that shattered his preconceived notions of the wild and of his own son, revealing a depth to Elias he had never imagined. From that day, the secret of the bears became a shared silence between Elias and his father. The initial fear gave way to a grudging respect, then a quiet wonder that slowly bloomed into acceptance and a burgeoning understanding. His father, a man of few words himself, began leaving extra fish and berries by the edge of the woods, sometimes even a small piece of cured meat from the smokehouse. He never accompanied Elias on his visits to the den, maintaining a respectful distance, but he watched from a distance, his stoic gaze softening as he saw the boy, once lost in his own quiet world, now moving with purpose and confidence, a bond forged with creatures of the wild. He started leaving the garage door unlocked, and Elias found new, stronger materials for Shadow's splint, and warmer bedding for the den, unspoken gifts from his father. A silent understanding, a new kind of family had begun to form, a bridge built between the human and animal worlds. As winter deepened, the cubs grew at an astonishing rate, their playful antics a source of quiet joy for Elias. Rumble became increasingly boisterous, often wrestling with Elias, pushing him gently with his head and engaging in mock battles, his paws surprisingly soft. Whisper would playfully steal Elias's hat and dart away, initiating a game of chase through the snowy undergrowth, her eyes sparkling with mischief. And Pebble, always the most affectionate, would demand hugs, standing on her hind legs and wrapping her small paws around Elias's waist, burying her face in his jacket with a soft chuffing sound, a gesture that melted his heart. It was during these embraces, feeling the warmth and trust of their wild hearts, that Elias felt a profound shift within himself. The old trauma began to recede, replaced by a surge of connection and love, a sense of being truly seen and valued, not for his words, but for his being, for the silent kindness he offered. He found comfort and freedom in the unconditional affection of these wild creatures, a liberation from the cage of his own silence. One particularly cold morning, as the sun struggled to break through the thick winter clouds, casting long, pale shadows across the snow, Elias's father watched from the cabin window as Elias walked into the snowy woods, followed by the 3 near-yearling cubs, their black forms stark against the white landscape. Elias stopped, and Pebble, now nearly waist-high, stood on her hind legs and embraced him, her head tucked into his shoulder in a familiar gesture. It was a gesture of pure, unadulterated affection, a silent display of a bond that defied all human understanding, a testament to the profound connection between a boy and his bears. His father saw the boy, still silent in speech to the human world, but eloquent in his actions, in his connection to these powerful, wild beings. A silent pride swelled in his chest. Later that day, a logging crew unexpectedly entered their part of the Blackwood, their chainsaws roaring to life, tearing through the peaceful air like monstrous beasts, their noise a violent intrusion. Elias, frantic, rushed to find Shadow and her cubs, his heart pounding with dread. He found them near the edge of their territory, agitated by the deafening noise, their primal instincts screaming danger, their powerful bodies tense with fear. His father, arriving minutes later, having followed Elias's urgent, panicked movements, saw the scene, the roaring chainsaws, the agitated bears, and Elias, standing before them, a desperate plea in his eyes, a silent scream to protect his chosen family. Suddenly, a sound ripped through the air, sharp and clear, cutting through the mechanical din. Not a human voice, articulate and formed, but a sound that resonated deep within the forest, a piercing, guttural cry that rose above the deafening whine of the chainsaws, a sound of raw, untamed emotion. It was Elias. For the first time in 5 years, a sound, rough and unpracticed, had escaped his throat. It was a raw, primal roar, a desperate attempt to warn and protect, a burst of pure, unadulterated emotion that finally broke through the long silence. The loggers, startled by the unexpected, inhuman sound, paused their work, their faces etched with confusion and a hint of fear, their hands frozen on their machines. Shadow, hearing the unexpected sound from Elias, a sound that mirrored her own protective growls, paused too, looking at him with a mix of surprise and understanding, a recognition of kinship in that wild cry. Elias's father rushed forward, wrapping his arms around his son, pulling him into a tight embrace, tears streaming down his weathered face, a flood of relief and wonder. "Elias," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You spoke. You spoke." Elias, exhausted but exhilarated, could only nod, a silent smile spreading across his face, a joy radiating from him that warmed his father's heart, a silent acknowledgement of the miracle. The words were still locked, but the sound, the intention, the raw emotional force, had broken through, shattering the years of silence. The loggers, confused and a little unnerved by the screaming bear boy and the sudden appearance of the wild animals, eventually retreated, deciding this section of the Blackwood was too much trouble, leaving the forest to its quiet inhabitants. The Blackwood Forest settled back into its quiet rhythm, the chainsaw echoes fading into the rustle of leaves and the whisper of wind. Elias's voice didn't fully return overnight, but the dam had broken. He began to make sounds, tentative at first, then stronger, communicating with gestures and guttural words until, slowly, haltingly, his true voice began to emerge, rough but real, a testament to the power of love and connection, a symbol of his healing journey. As spring returned, Shadow and her cubs, now strong and healthy, began to distance themselves, drawn by the wild call of the mountains. They were bears, after all, meant for the vastness of the wilderness, for a life beyond human touch. The day they finally left, disappearing into the deepest parts of the Blackwood, a pang of sadness went through Elias. A familiar ache of separation, but it was overshadowed by a profound sense of gratitude in his heart. He was no longer just the silent boy. He was the boy who had befriended bears, who had found his voice in their quiet strength, and who had brought a new understanding of connection and compassion to his family. His bond with the bears remained a living, unspoken thread in the tapestry of the forest. Often, he would leave small offerings of berries or a freshly caught fish at the edge of the woods, at the very spot where he had first found Shadow. And sometimes, days later, he would find a smooth river stone or a discarded feather in its place, a silent acknowledgement, a continuing promise, a conversation conducted without words, a secret shared between human and wild. And sometimes, though rarely, when the mountain winds carried just right, he would hear a distant, rumbling purr, a soft chittering, and perhaps, if he listened very closely, a faint, familiar whimper, the sound of 3 bear cubs who still remembered the boy who had shown them kindness, and who, with every visit home, still asked for a hug in their own unique, silent way, a love that transcended all understanding.